Hi there, I'm Kirk, and it's really good to have you along for another video here on my channel. And today we've got a big ticket box opening and review, and I've been really waiting with anticipation for these to come out. And they did come out and I got one, and I'm going to review it for you now. So without further ado, let's take a closer look. This is the Barclay 040 shunter from Hattons actually, and this is the second Hattons model that's come onto the market that is badged as such. And we've done a review of the P-Class, had a really good close look at that. So it was with much anticipation that I was expecting this to turn up, and I have to say I've not been disappointed. So we've got let's just have a look on the side here. Catalogue number H4 AB 16-004, and there's quite a few detail differences between the different ones that Hattons have done. They've done the 16-inch cylindered version, such as this one, but also the 14-inch version as well, which, to be honest, unless you really know what you're looking for, isn't necessarily the most obvious of differences between them. But they've also tooled up for a few other differences, such as the cab styles. They've got the open back, the closed back, and I think there's a few other bits and bobs as well, which can be different between the different versions that they've brought out. But this particular model, I've gone straight for this because this is a long-term resident of Trafford Park. It worked for Corn Products, and they later became known as Serastar. But right through into the 1970s, this particular example plied its trade on the Trafford Park estate, right up there, and actually the tracks are still there that this worked on. And if you look about online, there are actually a lot of photographs and videos of this locomotive working, because it was a late surviving steam working in an environment where you could actually get up really close and personal. And as those of you know, my display layout is Grove Street Yard, and it's kind of heavily inspired by Trafford Park. So when I saw this announced, I just put an order straight on in there because I couldn't miss this. Barclay were based in Kilmarnock. They were building steam locomotives to what was actually quite a distinctive design with this boxy saddle tank arrangement for a good number of decades. This particular design dates from around the late 1920s, and Hattons have offered these locomotives in a choice of different variations, but none of them are suitable for any earlier than perhaps at most about 1921, although Barclay had been making locomotives right back to the turn of that century. There have been a few reviews online. A few people got sent review copies of these a few months ago now, but not this particular one. I've not seen anybody review this, so we're going to be delving into this. And straight out of the box, I have to say, isn't that just such a darling little locomotive? I'm gushing a little bit here, but it's really is a livery which could have been quite bland, but actually it's been realised really, really well. So we've got this kind of a midnight blue stroke navy blue with wasp stripes on the buffer beams on the front there and also on the rear. And then we've got a few things like handrails picked out in the yellow, and then the CPC/United Kingdom on the tank sides. And it really does actually go together quite nicely. But let's just have a look through the nitty-gritty of all this. You do get in this package some separately applicable details, and they appear to include some vacuum pipes as well as some front couplings, and I've seen it said by quite a few people online that the vacuum pipes are somewhat superfluous, and I'll have to double check. I'm not actually sure whether this particular example had vacuum brakes fitted, so before I consider actually fitting these, and they are actually supplied here with the yellow painted on them to match the yellow on the buffer beams there, so it'll be interesting to see whether they are actually applicable to this locomotive. If they are, I will get those fitted. Now, it is a pretty diminutive size, it has to be said. I mean, after Hornby introduced their Peckett class locomotive, it really seems to have opened the floodgate for industrial style locomotives. So, to have a completely different manufacturer's product realised in 00 in model form is really, we are being spoiled here. The locomotive itself has a pretty good weight to it. It does feel like they've used a pretty dense material for the chassis, and probably through some quite clever design work in there have managed to fill an awful lot of the spare space with ballast weight. It does feel as though actually a lot of the structure of this is cast metal, so it feels like there's a cast metal running plate on there. And I think as well, the chassis frames and the boiler, the tanks, everything that can be made of metal has been, and that has added tremendously to the actual adhesion weight that this locomotive gives. As a size comparison, they've really got the presence of this Andrew Barclay shunter down to a T. Now I've got here to compare with it two other Trafford Park locomotives, and we've got the MSC Peckett from Hornby, and we can see that the Andrew Barclay is prototypically a bigger locomotive. We've also got the Hornby Sentinel in the MSC livery, and we can see there they're actually pretty much about the same size. Obviously a few detailed differences between steam and diesel locomotive, but in terms of a comparable size they're very much there. In terms of wheelbase, it's actually got a marginally shorter wheelbase than the Hornby Sentinel. I'm going to put that to one side and I'm going to compare it to the wheelbase. It's a slightly longer wheelbase than the Hornby Peckett, but not by an awful lot. In terms of performance when running, it has to be said of these three locomotives, the Hattons Andrew Barclay is probably marginally the better performer of the three, and I put that down to weight wise. It is noticeably heavier than the Hornby Peckett, and again noticeably heavier than the Hornby Sentinel. The buffers themselves, they're sprung, and they're actually, it's quite a powerful spring in there. They do feel very, very well put together. I know it's something that with, for example, Helgen models, I've always had a bit of an issue with their buffers because they seem to pop on out quite readily. The Oxford Rail ones have done as well, but for this locomotive I've not experienced any of those problems. Now, if you remember back to the P-Class review that I did last week it was, there was a few bits of detail such as the steps on the side that were very, very prone to damage. So I'm looking very closely here, and we don't seem to have the same problem with these. They're much, much sturdier in their construction, and they do look as though it's been moulded as one single piece rather than assembled out of three separate pieces, as was the case with the P-Class. Now, the actual pistons, the crosshead slides, the connecting rods on there, they are really finely realised. This example, it's a little bit oily, but that's entirely me. They don't come like that. And that's because I always like to oil some of these points on new locomotives, because I've had a few where I haven't done that straight out of the box, done a lot of running, and they do tend to start to wear. So just as a preemptive measure, there's a little bit of oil on this. It picks up from all four wheels. We can see on the backs of the wheels we've got some like phosphor bronze, rather springy strips that just sit against the backs of the wheels. Now, one of the things that I found, when I took this out to the shed and did a test run of this, initially it was somewhat jerky, and on closer inspection it wasn't picking up from one of the wheels. The little wiper was bent away from the wheels. So if you get one of these examples and they prove a little bit erratic when running them. Don't despair, but check out those wiper contacts up against the wheels. I bent them back into shape, and it really did make a huge difference. And when I've been out in the shed running this, it does go down to a reasonably slow speed, but because of that 040 chassis, it suffers exactly the same as the Hornby Peckets and the Hornby ex-Lancashire and Yorkshire Pugs and the Hornby Sentinels, that they do tend to struggle a little bit on track work that includes a lot of insul frog points and any particular undulations that might allow it to cock a wheel in the air and lose electrical contact in that way. That said, the superb amount of ballast weight that's in this does mean that in the grand scheme of things it does really, really well, and I didn't really experience a huge amount of problems with it. One particular niggle that I might have is that it does seem to be quite highly geared, so when you turn the power on the controller right up, it does go away at a very unprototypically high speed. But it does also go the other way down to quite a nice, pleasing crawl. Now, the benchmark for all of the locomotive mechanisms that I've reviewed over the years has to thus far be the Helgen Class 5 shunter, and that has been the smoothest motor by far. This model, compared to that, it wasn't quite as smooth, but it was certainly getting close. And it benefited greatly from an hour's running in. I run it 30 minutes forwards, 30 minutes in reverse, and that really did improve the mechanism a very, very noticeable amount. Other detail on here, well, this really is a wealth of detail. Hattons could have wimped out and skimped a bit because, you know, this is just a small shunting locomotive, but they haven't. The detail that has been applied, a separately applied detail, is really quite amazing. We've got all of this pipe work along the side of the boiler, and they really are separately applied details. We've got the springs there correctly applied. We've got a combination of sanding boxes. These are all separately applied details. And if we look on the other side, it's not really just a mirror image, but the pipework and the fittings do appear to be correct representation for the two sides of the locomotive. In the cab, I have to say, is where really the exquisite detail of this really comes in. It's probably a little bit difficult to see this with the camera, but we have separately applied pipes, fittings, gauges, regulator. They really look like they could move and work in there. And this is a 00 model, and it really is a tiny model, and yet all of these fittings are in there, and perfectly so, and they are separately applied details. I've seen some photographs where they've come loose in transit on somebody's model, and it just proved how many separately applied detail pieces there are that have gone into the construction of this. The other thing as well, which is a very, very obvious selling point for an Andrew Barclay shunter, is this brake stand. It's for the handbrake. And it had this very characteristic protrusion on the back of the cab with the standard going down there. And all of this is separately applied detail, so much so that when you turn this upside down, you can actually see the winding handle inside there. And it does look as if it's just ready to wind and apply the brakes to this model. All of the brake shoes line up perfectly with the wheel treads, and all of this is factory applied, separately fitted detail, and really those brakes look as if they are fine enough that they could just work. The couplings are in standard NEM pockets, so if you want to change these couplings, then they can be changed for any others that you want. They are fairly close in, so on very, very tight curves, if you space your rolling stock with short shanks on these, you may find there is a risk of some degree of buffer locking, but I haven't experienced this on Trinity Road, and actually the curves on Trinity Road can get quite tight, so I don't think it's as big a problem as it may initially appear just from visually looking at this. In terms of the tempo printing, well, we've got a very, very nicely detailed works plate on there. It was a very prominent feature of the Andrew Barclay shunters, and that has been well realised as a tempo printed edition. I do know that as aftermarket editions, there are companies offering etched brass works plate for these models, so if that's something that really takes your fancy, there is plenty of scope to customise and improve on this model. But that said, for me, that's perfectly good enough. I mean, it's it really is well realised, and under very close magnification I've got no doubts that that will be perfectly visible. On the tank sides, we've got the CPC/United Kingdom, and it is really sharply tempo printed. So we've got a very clear demarcation between the letters. There's no hint of fuzziness or bleed over there, and it really is nicely done. If we look on the other side, again, works plate and the CPC livery on there is all really well applied. The wasp stripes, again, crisp. There's no bleed between the two different colours, and they really do look striking to me, front and back. The cab windows, they do appear to be, let's have a look. They are flush glazed, but they do look a little bit on the thick side, and if you turn and look inside, it's something that was a little bit of a detraction to the P-Class as well, and that's carried over to the design of this model. I understand why Hattons have done it, but it is something that once you see it, it can look a little bit gaudy, but it can be hidden reasonably well by application of a crew in there. And it is something that Hattons sell as a aftermarket option. You can buy a crew specifically designed to go into these locomotives. But the glazing there is like one big bar along the back. And when we've got something as fine as this handbrake standard there, it really is a pity that they've chosen to do the cab windows in that way. If we look to the front of the cab, I can only assume that they've done it in a similar manner, but actually the front of the cab is much better realised, and I'm finding it impossible to see any hint of a bar of clear plastic across the back, and it's a shame really that they haven't done the back of the cab in the same way that they appear to have done the front. The safety valve on there, that is an exquisite separately applied detail. It is a plastic moulding, but it is fairly sturdy, but I don't really want to put that to the test. We've also got a whistle, and that does seem to wobble somewhat. I don't really want to put it to the test. It is separately applied, and it may be a metal item. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but certainly it does look the part. It does seem a little bit more robust than the Hornby Peckett, but even so, it's one to just be careful and be aware of when getting it in and out of the packaging. Overall, I have to say that Hattons have come up with another corker. Compared to the P-Class, it's really difficult. The P-Class for me was damn near perfect. This, it does have a few foibles. I wouldn't rate it quite as highly as the P-Class, but it really comes damn near as so close as to make no difference. It's a wonderful addition to the ready-to-run range from various manufacturers, and it leaves me thinking that I'm really looking forward to whatever else that Hattons has in the pipeline, because with their first two models, they have shown that they really are a force to be contended with. Well, I hope that video was informative to you. Don't forget to like this video, share it too, and also really important, subscribe to the channel and you'll be the first to know about new videos as and when they go up. And don't forget to ring that bell and you'll be notified when new ones go up. So thanks again for watching, and until next time, you take good care of yourself. Bye for now. Today's video has been brought to you in part thanks to the generous donation of my fans on Patreon. And a special huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Mark Anthony and Michael Churchwood. If you'd like to help support the show, head on over to patreon.com/Jennifer Kirk. Thank you. Today's video has been brought to you by my books, Bringing Home the Stars, Twinkle Little Star, and also you can get the complete comic collections of All Over the House, Books 1, Books 2, and also the wacky zany Life of Knob T. Mouse. Thanks, and catch you later.